We used to think that Canada was a free country, but now many of us don't even recognize it. Is there a more woke government than Prime Minister Trudeau's? Viva Frei is a Canadian-born lawyer and podcaster who documented the Freedom Convoy in Ottawa. He is sounding the alarm that Canada is sliding further into dictatorship with the help of the media. Whether you want to believe it or not, we're living in a world where even the word freedom is under assault. Americans, this is going to be hard, but we need to hear it. Viva, David. It's so great to have you here. I feel like I'm smiling now because we're having so much fun, except we're going to have such a serious conversation about scary things. And so, we're going to talk about Canada. I can't recognize Canada anymore. I used to think of Canada and the United States pretty much in lockstep as a positive thing, as beacons of freedom. I don't think we can look at Canada as a beacon of freedom. I'm not sure about the United States, which is why I'm so frightened about it. I know that you've been living in Canada for a long time and you actually left. And so let's hear a little bit about your background and what caused you to leave Canada.
Born and raised in Westmount. I've spent 1 year in Paris when I did an exchange, but I've lived in Montreal for my entire life. 3 or 4 years out in Quebec City when I was studying law. You don't recognize it, and I don't recognize it either. I mean, literally. I did a podcast a while back where I said, live in a country where the government literally turned our homes into prisons. I mean, literally, where you couldn't leave your house. It's nice that it's your house, but they've turned our home and my country into a big open-air prison. I've left temporarily. The 3-year visa, we'll see, if I renew or if I go for permanent residence, longer-term stuff. The entire world seems to be going crazy at an exponential rate. So it's not clear what's going to be left. Where do you want to be when things go down? But people need to pay attention to what's happening in Canada because it is, not to use the cancer analogy, whatever it is going to metastasize and spread from the top down, from the bottom up, and you're going to have America, and from east to west, because what we had in Canada, we've seen in California, we saw it in New York, and it's just going to slowly absorb the entire Western world with censorship for your own good, locking you down for your own good. Everything is going to be about usurping fundamental individual rights for the greater good, and then lo and behold, there's no good left.
Canada, to me, used to be a place where it was free. And I would think of Canada as a democracy. Is it still a democracy?
Kierkegaard said, life can only be understood backwards, but has to be lived forwards. Analyzing my life in Canada now retrospectively, I'm not sure if it ever was the democracy I thought it was. We grew up thinking we had free speech. We grew up saying sticks and stones can break my bones, yada, yada. I can say what I want. It's a free country. I mean, that was the thing kids said. And then I started becoming aware, again, retrospectively, of certain laws which came out and you said, well, it's not about censoring free speech. It's about protecting marginalized people. It's about protecting individual rights. People on my channel, even before I got into law and politics, on my channel said, you guys in Canada, you have no free speech. And I was like, you guys are wrong. Of course we do. And then I've seen things happen like Bill C-16. Back in the day, Jordan Peterson was raising the alarms about that. That was the amendment to the criminal code to add gender identity and gender expression, among other things, to aggravating factors for crimes. Jordan Peterson said this is going to result in compelled speech because if someone says you misgender me, it's going to be an aggravating factor for harassment or whatever. It's going to turn into a world where you have to gender someone in a way that is not according to your understanding of biology, lest you be accused of a literal crime. And it's materialist to some extent. British Columbia, there's the father who was jailed for contempt. It's a little more complicated than just saying misgendering his kid. He did maybe identify the doctors, and there's other stuff to it, but it's gotten there. And that was just one of the laws. And now you have all these other censorship online. I don't know if the country was ever free, but it did a good job pretending it was. People certainly were led to believe it was. And now that we've sort of had that veil lifted, I don't know that people can actually appreciate it. And they do now have to reframe it into the censorship is necessary to preserve a free society, which is ironically literally what politicians are saying. Right. We have to fortify elections to preserve democracy. We have to limit speech to protect individual rights. And not to go full Ayn Rand, but there is no individual right. There's no greater minority than the individual. And if you don't respect individual rights, you cannot be said to respect minority rights. But lo and behold, in Canada, you can't say certain things to protect certain minorities while other minorities, get fired and kicked out of the military if they don't submit to certain medical procedures.
Well, I can't help but think about Atlas Shrugged, because so many capable people that I know that lived in Canada who can leave, like you, are actually leaving. And so I'm wondering what has been going on in Canada that Americans don't know about. Because if you sit here as an American, you would think that all these Canadians are just so happy. And I mean, they can't possibly be happy if people are actually leaving. What are the specific things that Trudeau has done? I'll add one more thing. I remember in 2014, somebody wrote an article for Huffington Post, actually, warning people that if Trudeau gets elected, they will never recognize Canada anymore.
Daniel Dicken from the Huffington Post, when the Huffington Post actually still reported news, he said it would be the beginning of a Chinese-type dictatorship. His father ran the country not very differently than Trudeau. He loved socialism. He had an affinity towards it the same way Justin Trudeau has professed an affinity towards the basic dictatorship of China. Pierre Elliott Trudeau, his dad, invoked the War Measures Act during the FLQ crisis, which was the Front Libération de Québec, which was in and of itself a legitimate national crisis where you had separatist radicals in Quebec who were setting off pipe bombs, kidnapping politicians. Someone actually died. A grandfather of someone I went to law school with, it's Laporte was his name, but was kidnapped, murdered, stuffed in the trunk of a car. This is during the FLQ crisis in the 70s. So Trudeau invoked the War Measures Act, justifiably so, but then went way overboard with it, used it as a persecution tool for ideological adversaries. Justin Trudeau Jr. is, I think, the second person in Canadian history to invoke the Emergencies Act, which was what followed or replaced the War Measures Act, invoked it abusively to end this protest, weaponized it to freeze bank accounts, all this other stuff. Commission, which was called under the law to investigate the context of the invocation of the act, after 6 weeks of trial, came to the conclusion that it was acceptable to have invoked the Emergencies Act to quell a protest which occupied 4 streets in downtown Ottawa.
Wow.
People look back and say that it started with Trudeau's father. And when they looked at Trudeau, this kid who had absolutely no meaningful political experience, but for his last name, he had absolutely no meaningful work experience. He never ran a business.
Right. What did he do?
He was the high school drama teacher. And there's nothing wrong with that. It's just that if you're going to make the leap from that to prime minister of a country, you might want to have some more professional experience. I don't consider myself equipped to be prime minister. I at least, studied philosophy, got an honors degree in philosophy, a law degree, practiced law I ran my own law firm for 7 or 8 years. And even then I said, okay, well, I don't know enough about the economy. I know enough to say the budget doesn't balance itself, as Trudeau's infamously said. He had no credentials other than his last name and his charisma, which I think now most people are nauseated by. And so people saw that the country was going downhill since Pierre Elliott, since this Charter of Rights, which we have, which is sort of like a Constitution light. We have something that's called the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. And it's sort of like the United States Constitution, protects freedom of religion, association. There's absolutely no Second Amendment in there.
Okay.
But everyone's like, your Charter of Rights means nothing because on the one hand, there's a provision of this law that allows the legislator to deliberately violate certain rights that are guaranteed in that charter if the law specifically provides for the violation. There's a temporal limitation, et cetera. And then there was the first article, which says, these are your rights and freedoms, except in as much as can be infringed in a free and democratic society. And COVID has now showed us, the threshold for violating the most fundamental rights and freedoms, association, mobility, religion to some extent. That's a long-winded answer to say that people saw this coming from decades ago. I can now retrospectively look back and say, okay, at least since Trudeau, and maybe since the adoption of our Charter of Rights in 1982, because it has such big caveats in it that it's not worth the paper it's written on. And we've all seen that materialize in real time now.
Because they basically can announce some sort of emergency.
They will.
Well, they're trying to do that in the US too.
Absolutely. Like the Constitution did not provide for a virus exception.
Right.
Ours, literally, we had the Section 33 called the Notwithstanding Clause, which said you have linguistic rights, but, French Quebec can violate those linguistic rights if they specifically say it. Can't last longer than 5 years, so that if the population doesn't like it, they vote out the tyrants. You can't do it for certain rights, like mobility rights, but that's Section 33, the Notwithstanding Clause. It's baked into Section 1 of the Charter that says, these are your rights, except in as much as they can be violated in a free and democratic society, which is supposed to be like the highest of thresholds, not like, we don't know what's going on, so shut down your businesses, stay at home, you can't go to church anymore,
right.
Which is what it turned into under Trudeau.
Were things better under Prime Minister Harper?
I wasn't politically conscious enough to even be able to look back and answer that question. I know people hated Harper. It's the political amnesia. Everybody now, when McCain died, everyone, McCain was a hero. When he was alive, he was the same Nazi that they called everybody else. Right. George Bush now is the savior of the left. Everybody loves him. Back in the day, I remember them calling Bush racist, all the stuff they call Trump. So I know that they were calling Harper the same names that they called every conservative back in the day. The country seemed to be a little more politically unified. I mean, even though there was political strife, we don't have the ethnic, racial, identity politics division that has, it's run wild under Trudeau, but it's his MO as being prime minister. So whether or not it was better, I don't know.
What about just the basic violations of freedom? Like, I know that in recent years, Canadian guns have been taken away. And I'm not just talking about assault rifles, right? Like, you're not allowed to even have a handgun in Canada anymore. Is that right?
That's been that way for a long time. So I took the firearm course a couple years ago now, and I got my license because I wanted to know what it was about. But I got my license for unrestricted firearms, which can only be long arms. Small arms are restricted. They've been restricted for, if it's not a half decade, it's close to a decade.
Okay.
Small arms you have to have a special license to get. You can't have them for self-defense. You can only have them if you're sport shooting, if you're involved in athletics or whatever, competition. You cannot have them or even long arms for self-defense. And there's maybe some very limited exceptions where if you absolutely need it because you're a criminal lawyer with the mob after you, whatever. But to get that, it's a specific license to own a small arm. The unrestricted, I took a 2-day course, passed a test, had a background check, had to have my wife sign off that she's okay with having a
everybody approved.
Everybody approved, and that's only good for 5 years. So if you don't get along with your wife in 5 years, you're not getting a renewal. They've been heavily restricted for a very long time. Pandemic comes, you have the Nova Scotia shooting, which oddly enough, nobody talks about it, was committed with unlawfully procured firearms. It's not like the existing laws didn't work. And then Trudeau comes in under the darkness of the pandemic with what's called an order in council, because the legislation allowed for him to amend it and make new regulations without having to go through the legislative process again, just slaps on 1,500 different types of firearms. They call assault rifles, which doesn't mean anything. I'm not a firearm expert, but assault rifle is not a thing. It's a look. We've always been limited to, I think with long arms, it's 5 rounds per magazine. So we've already had restrictions up the wazoo. But because gun crime is still increasing, it's not just still exists, it's going up more than it's going up radically.
Even with all the laws.
Even with all of it, because it's not committed with lawfully procured firearms. The dude who does a 2-day course and has a license.
It's the criminals who actually
black market guns coming from the States and coming from further south. So all of the laws are useless. But there's no crisis that's too small for the government to exploit to further expand its powers and limit the rights of the citizens. That's been like that for a long time. We, as Canadians, have no right to self-defense. Can't have pepper spray, can't have tasers, can't have anything designed to be a weapon of self-defense. If you're walking around downtown with a baseball bat, unless you have a glove and a ball, that's borderline. We've been stripped of fundamental rights for a long time in Canada. People don't seem to care because it's relatively safe, unless you live in Toronto, Montreal, or Vancouver. Or you live in Nova Scotia, where a guy goes on a killing spree for 24 hours in an RCMP car. And then in order to deal with that crisis, they take away more rights of law-abiding citizens. The fascinating thing is why Canadians don't care and why they think a government that has historically been incompetent, corrupt, immoral, and genocidal, because they do refer to prior governments as genocidal, why they think the current government would be any better in protecting their rights currently than past governments have been at violating your rights systematically.
Right, and why are they giving them even more power, right? If you're disappointed with the government, why would you give more power to the government? I'm glad you said that about Canadians, because I didn't want to be offensive to Canadians listening, but here I go and I'm saying it. It does come across like Canadians overall are just complacent, except that Canadians have tried so hard with the Freedom Convoy, and I know that you have covered that extensively. The media has done everything they could to make sure that nobody hears about what is happening there. Will you tell me a little bit what you saw there? I mean, you were there on the ground, right?
I was even then careful to say I'm there documenting, not participating, because from day one they were like anyone who participated was a menace to society.
Right.
We'll get back just to get to the offensive thing. Canadians, on the whole, are more complacent than Americans. It's not an insult. It's a difference in culture. It's a difference in history, where Americans and those who flocked to America to seek a better life and to like fight for freedom and for a better life had a different mentality. The country that fought the British for its own independence is far different than one that relied on Britain to grant it its rights. It's a self-fulfilling prophecy to some extent. People who come to Canada come there because they have the what's the word? The stereotype, sort of the preconceived notion that it's for more polite people. People who go to Florida, the stereotype is you go to Florida is because you're a radical. I think it's bogus, but it does sort of have its own self-fulfilling prophecy. Canadians definitely think there is value in being subservient to the government and being polite and just going along with it. The problem is, like a lobster that goes along with it to a certain point, and at some point it can't back out of the cage. I think Canadians are there now. And then once you're stuck in the cage, how do you rationalize your imprisonment to yourself? You say, well, it's for my own good, so I'm going to live with it. The convoy itself, there's enough Canadians who are fed up as well. So I was doing the law videos and the vlogs, and I was walking the streets during curfew with my dog, bitching about everything going on in Canada. And in the chat and in the comment section, people were like, Viva, why aren't you talking about the convoy? It was before it got there, and I hadn't heard of it because I'm sitting there in the thick of it, and I hadn't heard of the convoy.
Wow.
And then people start calling me like controlled opposition. Viva's trying to hide the convoy because the government's got to him.
Oh, well, I was like, Viva the liberal.
Oh, no, that was what the Americans were thinking. In Canada, like, why isn't Viva, he's been compromised. It's like, I didn't hear of this protest, this convoy that was in the works. Then I was like, okay, I'm going to look into it. And I go Google Convoy Canada. And what do I find? There's a convoy going from, it wasn't Whistler to Vancouver, but it was between two cities in British Columbia, and they're protesting road conditions. This is from the CBC. State-funded propaganda. It's like
road conditions?
There was a convoy. This is why it's like, it's not a lie. It's just a lie through misdirection.
Diversion.
There was a convoy. They were protesting road conditions. It was some measly, non-eventful convoy of truckers driving from two towns in British Columbia. It wasn't the one that was going from
the big real one.
From Vancouver to Ottawa and from Nova Scotia to Ottawa. And so when they could no longer deny the existence of that convoy, then the CBC starts reporting on it, but saying it's not so big. Then they're like, oh, they can't deny how big it is because we're seeing the videos of these truckers driving through overpasses. And it's not just the convoy of truckers. People sitting there freezing their fingers off. Then they say, well, we can't deny how big it is, the CBC and the other state-funded media. So now they have to demonize it in advance. Extremists, anti-science, anti-vaxxers, all this crap.
Violent,
well,
terrorists.
They I don't know if they dropped those yet, but then when it descended on Ottawa, then they had to get that one image of that one guy with a Nazi flag and that one guy whoever brought a Confederate flag to a Canadian protest. I mean, and the media fell for it. Good for those idiots because they understand nothing. But then they had to demonize it as being xenophobic. I mean, this is Trudeau said it's a protest. What do you call them? Anti-black racists, transphobes, homophobes, anti-Semites, anti-science, anti-vaxxers. This is what Trudeau himself tweeted at one point. May he never forget it. I'm actually at a Project Veritas event in Florida, and people are again saying, Viva, why aren't you on the ground here looking at what's going on? And I was like, I'll get there as soon as I get back to Montreal. And I had read the news from the CBC, Nazi flags everywhere, people pissing on the war memorial, desecrating the Terry Fox memorial. So I drive down with my live stream and say, if this is what's going on, the world's going to see it as I see it, because I'm not there to lie. I'm not there to cover up anything. And if it's happening, the world should know. It wasn't happening. Like I've never felt happier, more safe, more secure in Ottawa. Ottawa's not the nicest city in Canada, especially downtown. There's a lot of homelessness. There's a lot of drug addiction. It's not a place where you walk at night on ordinary days. I get down there. It was the wildest, and I say wildest in surreal, not it was just, the honking of the horns for the first 4 days was something out of a cartoon. It was something out of a movie. It was loud. They had people dancing. It was the most glorious thing I'd ever seen. The desecration of the Terry Fox memorial. Terry Fox was the guy, he had cancer, started running across Canada, ended up dying. He's a legend in Canada. The desecration of his memorial in downtown Ottawa. Someone stuck a Canadian flag in through his hand and a sign that said, I think it was something that said pro-choice sign. That was the desecration of the flag. Of course, when the Gay Pride has their thing and they put the Gay Pride flag in Terry Fox's hand, the media loves it. It's the double standard is just unbelievable. The desecration of the War Memorial, I don't know if it was piss, coffee, or human piss, or a dog piss. Like there was a little pitzel of a pee that the media says they urinated all over the monument. It was bullshit from beginning to end.
And you took videos and pictures.
I was there. I was like, I'm walking around. I started talking to the veterans who were protecting the War Memorial. I was walking around asking cops. I was like, have you guys seen any violence? Have you seen any vandalism? All of them said no. At one point, a cop said, yeah, there's a broken window down there. I was like, okay, where is it? And then he laughed like, I'm joking, dude. It had nothing to do with the protest. It was the best. It's tough to explain. It was, I'd never smiled so much. I'd never seen so many beautiful dogs. Like people had their dogs down there, which I wouldn't have done myself because it was very noisy, but the most beautiful pit bulls and big dogs ever. The people were beautiful. They were sitting there camping in their cars for 3 weeks. Honking their horns, but then they stopped honking their horns after about a week. There was a court injunction, and even the protesters were trying to be humane with those who didn't want them there, and understandably so, who didn't want them there, but it was a thing of beauty. What
message did you mostly hear? What were they actually chanting for?
Freedom. I mean, they were chanting for I think it was the CBC, more state-funded propaganda, who said the freedom has become the rallying call of the far right. Very ironic because my last name, Freiheit, literally means freedom. So they're calling me. It was freedom. It was, we want to see faces. We want our kids to have a normal life. I mean, I was seeing kids there who said the years of their life have been miserable. I interviewed a
So
woman.
They were against the lockdowns?
They were against the lockdowns, the mandates, and basically the government overreach.
And the forced vaccination.
It started off as the vaccine mandates because that was what pushed the truckers really to move. But it was all the mandates. I mean, I interviewed a woman who she lost 2 kids during the lockdown to overdose. She was broken, like just physically broken. You could look at her. There's no unbreaking or healing of that type of trauma. She's sitting there with the image of her kid on her car, and she says, "I'm not leaving. They'll arrest me, cuff me, take me away." And what do those? Can't swear too much. I have to stop. What do those coward politicians do? Justin Trudeau doesn't take 1 second to come down to talk to anybody. Jagmeet Singh, who's the leader of the NDP, he came down when there was a recent protest, says, I'm on Parliament Hill, I'm talking to the protesters, we're going to take our labor dispute to the government. It's like, well, where the hell were you when a woman was mourning the loss of her 2 kids from overdose because of your lockdown policies? So they didn't talk to them for 1 second. They were hoping, and Trudeau, and we now know because of the commission, was hoping for a January 6th moment, which never happened. There was not one shred of violence until Trudeau sicked his militarized police on the crowd, physically assaulted veterans, arrested a bunch of people, invoked the War Measures Act, which is now the Emergencies Act, to violently suppress the most peaceful protest ever because it was infrastructure threats and causing economic damage to the country. He was complaining that the protest was causing economic damage to the country after he'd spent 2 years locking down the country.
Unbelievable.
It was 3 weeks in Ottawa. Ottawa's business is the government. It's not like they weren't going around like breaking windows of people's homes. They were protesting in the 4 blocks on Parliament Hill.
Well, one of the crazy reactions that we had watching all of this here in the United States is, and I know, by the way, many Americans actually donated money to support these freedom fighters, and their bank accounts were frozen.
Well, so this is the beauty of it. At first, they said this is being funded by Russians, foreign interests.
Another Russian collusion.
Yeah. The GoFundMe, the original the GoFundMe that raised $10 million in a week was 90% Canadian donations. GoFundMe, if anybody doesn't know this, and don't ever use GoFundMe. I call them Go F Me because that's basically what should happen to them and what they did to everybody. They said, and now we know because it's the mayor of Ottawa, I think it was Jim Watson, but it doesn't really matter who, someone in the government pressured GoFundMe to shut down the fundraiser on the basis that it was promoting violence.
They probably went through NewsGuard or one of those like fact-checking companies. You and I were on that panel the other day, right?
No, this I think it was even more direct. I think they literally sat down with the execs or met with the politicians, met with the execs at GoFundMe and said, this is being used to fund violence. Like when they have criminals who have GoFundMe pages, no problem. When it's for BLM and their Summer of Love, no problem. They met with them and said, shut down the GoFundMe because it's being used for violence. GoFundMe then froze it. They froze it twice, but they froze it the second time for good and said, we're giving this money to another charity. So we're shutting it down because it's being used for violence and criminality, and we're going to give the 10 million to a charity. People went ballistic, and they said, no, we're going to all file contestations with our credit card companies. It's going to cost you millions. They said, okay, we're going to reimburse those who ask for it. Whatever's left over, we're going to give to a charity of the convoy's choosing. And then everyone's like, still no. They reimbursed it. It was only after they reimbursed it and they set up a new fundraiser with Give, Send, Go, which is the only one anyone should use. They set up a new one with Give, Send, Go, and that's when 50% of the monies came from the United States. Because by that time it had reached the States. Everyone's like, holy crab apples. They're trying to shut down protests. They're trying to shut down their ability to fundraise for political purposes, which is kind of a charter right. And that's when it pissed off the rest of the world, especially the States, and a substantial portion of the funding came from the States. Originally, it was 90% Canadian.
What ended up happening with all of that? I mean, did everybody end up getting vaccinated? Did everything just fizzle out? I mean,
So what happened is, after about 3.5 weeks, Trudeau, while they're on the cusp of a negotiated agreement to free up some of the streets, we now know this because of the commission, the investigation into the invocation of the act, they were on the cusp of an agreement. Trudeau didn't want the agreement, so he rejected one of these proposals for a resolution and invoked the Emergencies Act. He comes out on television, says, after much consideration, that's how he talks. After much consideration, I have decided to invoke the Emergencies Act. We're not going to violate your charter rights. We're not bringing in the military. I was there. They didn't bring in the military. They brought in RCMP, heavily armed RCMP. They brought in armored vehicles. They brought in snipers on roofs. They brought in drones. They brought in, for anybody who knows how it works, RCMP is Royal Canadian Mounted Police. It's the federal unit. They brought in the Ottawa Provincial Police, the OPP. They brought in the Sudbury Police, which is another area. They brought in the Sûreté de Québec, which is the police from Quebec. Rifles, batons, and they came in and, no joke and no exaggeration, they beat the ever-loving piss out of veterans, out of protesters. They like swept it like they did it like a military campaign. They detonated stun grenades or concussive grenades, and I know because I was 10 feet from one. I'm sitting there with my iPhone, just like a noob, documenting the police taking their militaristic steps one step forward, and they detonate concussive grenades. I don't know why, if it wasn't to trigger a panic response from the crowd. And over the course of 2 days, they arrest, detain, assault protesters, and lock off downtown Ottawa for another couple of months. And Canadian citizens were fine with it because these were extremists, and they got their downtown Ottawa back.
This is like utter disbelief for me to hear some of this stuff. I mean, I was aware of some of the pieces, but Canada, I mean, China, I would believe you. Russia, I would believe you. But Canada, for this to happen, the collusion between the Prime Minister and the government and the way they control the media. I mean, the fact that the Canadian government basically owns the media in Canada, and we're not thinking to ourselves, wow, that sounds a lot like Pravda in Russia or China.
It's the literal definition of fascism, which is the government working with big companies, working with the media in tandem to control messaging. CBC, Canada Broadcasting Corporation, it's a crown corporation. So they're funded, along with Radio-Canada, which is the French version, $1.2 billion a year. Taxpayer dollars. That's how they're funded. This is the same CBC that recently just put out that video, which is nothing less than grooming of children. It was called...
that's that transgender video?
No, this one was a drag queen question hour with children, with young kids who in the video are visibly uncomfortable with the situation. They have a drag queen asking the kids how old they are and how old the kids think they are. And that's the CBC. Same CBC that was covering the events, talking about the Nazi flags that defined the protest. What Americans are not paying attention to enough, in my view, and I've been reaching out to a lot of the outlets it's not the protest. They were all interested in the protest because it started a international movement. They don't know how it ended. It didn't end well. I said that protest was the white pill of my last 3 years. It was the most beautiful thing I'd seen in 3 years. When Trudeau came in with his police and violently suppressed it, I said that was the black pill of my life. So then under the law, they have to have a commission to investigate into the circumstances of the invocation. I was like, okay, that'll be the white pill. Like, I didn't realize that the story's not over yet. It's another chapter. They're going to have a 6-week commission. They're going to hear all this evidence. The court, this commissioner, Rouleau, is going to come down and say, Trudeau, you had no business doing what you did. Shame on you. Canada has been restored with the rule of law. We had a 6-week hearing on this thing, evidentiary hearing. The evidence was so laughable. in terms of the justification to invoke this. Trudeau, you had like the Ottawa authorities saying people were being aggressed or had microaggressions. The truckers were making fun of them for wearing masks, which was bullshit because people were wearing masks and everybody knew it because they didn't want to get identified because they knew that if they were there supporting the truckers and worked for the government, they'd lose their job.
They brought up the police because truckers were making fun of them. I mean, this really sounds like somebody who used to manage a drama class.
They literally use the term microaggressions. Then some of them were saying, when the protesters were like, we had hundreds of thousands of people there, they're like, no, there weren't. There were only tens of thousands. Like, so there are only tens of thousands and you need to invoke the So all that say, 6 weeks of the most laughable testimony that you could possibly imagine, incompetence between one level of the government and another, bickering between one level of the government and another. Trudeau comes out and says, protesting to affect public change is something that I find very worrisome. I mean, this is like President Xi is looking at him and saying, you dummy, you don't say the quiet part out loud. And then
here is the book on how to do it.
He says, we find protesting to affect policy change is very dangerous. Like, well, thank you for saying that. And then people are like clipping it. This is amazing. He wants to basically outlaw protest. The evidence was a joke. I thought the commissioner understood it. I thought the commissioner grasped the absurdity of invoking the nuclear bomb of legislation to end a protest. And then I was listening to the policy discussion that ensued after the evidentiary hearings. And you have these intellectuals, these scholars sitting around saying, well, freezing bank accounts is a very effective way of ending a protest because you get names, and if they don't leave when you tell them to, you can freeze. I was like, no crap. That's also called total communism. But then I'm hearing them talk about this, like, holy crap, this might go south. Commissioner comes out in his final report and says Trudeau was justified in invoking the Emergencies Act, the War Measures Act, even though there were legal remedies that existed. You're only supposed to be able to invoke the Emergencies Act when there's no existing legislation to quell a national security. Judge came in and said, it's fine. Freezing of bank accounts is an effective way of ending or deterring protests. And I'm like, no crap it is. It's just not a constitutional free society way of doing it. But the judge came in and said, Trudeau, you're good. Here's a pat on the back. You went a little too far when you asked to cancel insurance on the vehicles, which makes sense because if their insurance is canceled, they can't even drive them out of there if they wanted to. But that's it, ratified.
That's unbelievable.
It's unbelievable. But people are not freaking out about that here. The people who were interested in this movement because it was invigorating for the rest of the world don't understand that it got stomped to death by the boot of the government.
Well, I think the government and the prime minister have been so masterful at really controlling the media that even in America, even in conservative circles, it's hard to understand what is going on there. And what's unbelievable to me is this whole concept of a media bailout. And so in 2019, apparently Trudeau gave $600 million to the media. I mean, no wonder he owns them. And then more money came out in 2021. Like, what?
It's cannot be underestimated in terms of the control that he has over the media. CBC, Radio-Canada are the state broadcasters. They are subsidized by taxpayer dollars. Print media wasn't, but it was flailing because A, it's a dying media, and B, they suck at what they do. Nobody wants to read that crap. Everybody knows it's garbage, and so nobody reads it. In order to help them, the digital age is killing the print media, so we're going to bail them out with $600 million, which he does. Some people, and myself included at one time, was sort of under the impression that applied to the digital media, which it doesn't. So the $600 million was for print media. The digital media got a different type of bailout, a very convenient one called COVID. So when COVID hit, among other things, government advertising is always just indirect subsidy to digital media. When COVID hit, they were running stay-at-home ads. They weren't running wash your hands ads. When they were rolling out the vaccine, they were literally running ads to the effect that little Jimmy wanted to go to a rock concert, but he couldn't get in because it had a vaccine mandate and he regretted not getting vaccinated. They had produced these ads and were running these ads all over digital media. So directly, indirectly, the government is controlling, directly or indirectly, through finance or coercion, the media. And if they don't toe the line, they get their government ads pulled, and then fend for yourself in this era where even digital media is having its own problems competing with independent media.
Could non-pro-government media entities apply for grants as well? Could they receive funding as well? Or is it only the ones that, Trudeau happens to approve?
There hasn't been the most transparency in terms of who got the bailouts for the digital, not for the digital, for the print. One thing is for certain. We know who has been in Trudeau's good graces. There was this video clip that went viral where Trudeau was at some gala and he makes a joke about, a lot of people say that the media has been very nice to me for no good reason, but there's a very good reason, because I paid them $600 million. And then he runs a few headlines which he thinks are critical of him. Trudeau has survived scandals that would have put a conservative in jail. Trudeau has twice been found guilty of violating the Federal Ethics Act or the Conflict of Interest Act. The first time was when he took a private island. It was like $50,000 or $60,000 private island vacation to this guy, the Aga Khan, his private island, while the Aga Khan was petitioning the federal government for tens of millions of dollars and got it. So he takes an all expenses trip paid to the Aga Khan's private island and doesn't disclose it. Second ethics violation was when he, again, woman lover Trudeau, appoints, and he takes social media credit for it, appoints the first Indigenous Minister of Justice and Attorney General, Jody Wilson-Raybould, to the position. He's a woman-loving man, and an Indigenous woman-loving man, no less, appoints her, fires her when she doesn't adhere to his corrupt demands to not criminally prosecute this international construction conglomerate called SNC-Lavalin, because he's chummy with them. So she wanted to prosecute them. He wanted her to enter into a deferred prosecution agreement, let them off the hook, and she said, no, I'm going to prosecute them because they're involved in corruption in Libya. And he says, okay, well, now you're shuffled out of the cabinet. And he was found guilty a second time of ethics violation for exercising undue influence on the independent discretion of the Minister of Justice and Attorney General. Third ethics complaint was his mother was getting paid by a charity that his government then attributed a sole source government contract to. Child's play stuff. Other scandals, the blackface scandal where the media was sitting on pictures of Justin Trudeau having worn blackface more times than he can count. Back in 2000, he allegedly groped a reporter and apologized to the reporter behind the group. He owns the media that has kept this corrupt guy in power. And now there's the recent scandal with the Chinese Communist Party actually financing liberal candidates and interfering with our elections. But the control of the media is incredible. It's insidious. And the degree, that he then says RT, Russia television, can't be aired in Canadian airspace because it's government subsidized propaganda. It takes audacity, lack of insight, and a presumption that your electorate are a bunch of ignorant buffoons and don't know the degree to which you are doing.
That's exactly what they do.
Well,
right? Oh, the elite knows everything. The electorate knows nothing. Let's protect them. Let's make sure that they don't hear stuff so that it doesn't hurt their little brains. Let's make the decisions for them. What are these new bills that they're passing? C11, C16, the other censorship stuff?
We got the bill C16, which was back in the day. That was adding gender identity to the criminal code. One that people don't know about, and it'll get Trudeau off the hook for a second. This is who I call the dictator François Legault out of Quebec, where I left temporarily. Although we'll see if they ever let me back.
They're not going to let you back. I don't know where you're going to go.
They have this bill. It's called Bill 15, which amended the Youth Protection Act to eliminate parental supremacy as the overarching guiding principle of the application of the law. The idea being, look, if the parent wants to abuse their child, parental supremacy can't be what we use to determine what's in the best interest of the child. So now it's the state, the administrative state, that determines the best interest of the child in the application of the Youth Protection Act out of Quebec. This was done during the context of COVID. This is done during the context of this entire trans debate now, where I told my wife, they passed this, parents are going to lose control over their kids. It's going to take one fight between a kid and their parents for the kid to go call the government and say, my parents don't want me to get puberty blockers.
This is where my heart starts racing. This really sets me off.
As it should. As it should, because this was one of the lines in the sand that I said. Is they do this, they're eliminating a parent's right to say, I don't want to vaccinate my kid. I don't want to allow my kid to go through gender affirming care, which is, puberty blockers and whatever. So that's out of Quebec. That's Bill C-50.
It's not just eliminating the parent's right. It's eliminating the parent's responsibility, right? It's as parents, it is our responsibility to protect our kids and guide our children so that when they're confused about their life, they're not actually misguided to go and take medication, puberty blockers, and castrate themselves. It's not just a right of the parents, it's the responsibility of the parents to protect these children. And that's the problem when the government comes in. It's actually eliminating the responsibility of parents to actually take care of children.
And in Quebec, and we've had a bit of this in New York, you had judges granting custody of children to the parent who wanted the kid to get vaccinated, or the vaccinated parents, stripping unvaccinated parents of visitation rights.
And now they'll do that with parents who are willing or wanting to castrate their kids versus not.
There's no limit as to what they're going to do. And I said, if this passes, this is the line in the sand, because this is when a rebellious kid will get the tentacles of the government into the family unit, and the government never lets go once it gets its hooks in. Out of Canada, another line in the sand, I said, Bill C-11, which is called the Online Streaming Act. And that is, they always say it's about two things, benevolence and money. So the government says, this is about preserving Canadian culture. We want to make sure that we have this bill called the Broadcasting Act, which governs radio and television to ensure that there's certain Canadian content, a certain amount of Canadian content, certain obligations, because they're benefiting from airwaves and radio waves. They want to amend that, and they're going to add the internet. So online streaming is going to have to comply with the provisions of the Broadcast Act, Canadian content, penalties if you don't do it. They wanted to apply to the internet. And when they originally drafted this, it was Bill C-10 at the time that died because the legislative session ended. They just went through with this Bill C-11, which basically says if you create content online, you're going to be deemed to be something of a publisher what did they say? A broadcaster. And therefore, you're going to be governed by this act. You're going to have to pay certain dues, have certain Canadian content requirements. They call it CanCon. Initially, there was an exception for individual channels, individual social media platforms. They inserted the exception to say this is not going to apply to individual accounts. Then in the dead of night, again, this is during COVID, they removed the exception and then say, we're going to pass this. And then people are like, you remove the exception for individual accounts, and their minister, whoever he was, Guilbeault, he says, we don't want it to apply to individual accounts. So that's not what the purpose of the law is. And then we were saying, well, you specifically included an exception that you then specifically removed. What's to make sure that you're not going to do it? Eventually, they said, yeah, well, we are going to apply it to individual accounts if they act like a broadcaster. So basically, like my type of social media, I'm an individual, but maybe I act like a broadcaster because I reach hundreds of thousands of people. They're going to impose requirements which are purely arbitrary, purely discretionary, because the CBC spends a lot of time covering the impeachment, but that's going to be Canadian content. And that law is gonna pass now. It's like it's pretty much.
That's the law that they were selling Canadians as, oh, let's promote Canadian content because Netflix is taking over.
Absolutely.
And there's too much American content, and so let's make it great for Canada. But really, it's not. It's more let's control the media.
What it is let's get the administrative body to sink its hooks into people we don't like, ideological adversaries, entities that are competing with us. Then they came in with it competing with us being the government. And then they came in with its Bill C-18, which is like determining what's authoritative news on the internet in terms of regulating news sources on the internet, which is obviously intended to reestablish the predominance or the dominance that state-funded media had when it had a monopoly on radio and television. Like CBC, Radio-Canada, when there was no internet and they were on television and radio, you had no other choice. That's where you went for your news. Now that you got the internet, you go to Rebel News, you go to True North, you go to Post Millennial, you maybe even go to Viva Frei. CBC and the state, our allies, the ones we've bought out or bought up, they're losing their dominance, and they're actually just losing their market share. How do we reestablish this? We've got to get control over the wild west of information, being the internet, and this is how to do it. It's pure censorship, but it's always sold as being for your own protection, disinformation protection. We can't have foreign interference in Canadian politics, even though Trudeau has no problem taking literally $1 million from the Chinese Communist Party for his father's Pierre Elliott Trudeau Foundation. Very analogous to the Clinton Foundation in terms of the pay-to-play type influence. People just don't know, and they don't care.
Do they not care? I wanted to ask you that. Are Canadians actually waking up?
Some are, and some are, I believe, genuinely too far into the lie to admit to themselves that they've been fooled. I mean, the Mark Twain expression, it's easier to fool someone than it is to convince them they've been fooled. There's a good ego reason, there's a good psychological reason, and in a way, there's also a good responsibility reason. Like, if people start to wake up now, and they start to say, oh yeah, look at that, there are certain statistics about a certain medical procedure that we now have to accept, and I've not only exposed myself to this, which is one thing, I've submitted my children to this, and if I have to admit that I expose my children to certain risk, what does that make me? It doesn't just make me dumb, it makes me having potentially harmed the ones that I love the most. How do you deal with that type of psychological trauma? You bury it deep down and you say it didn't happen.
It's too hard to accept.
It is. It is. It's like you can't admit that you were duped and that you may have exposed the people you are on this earth to protect to harm. There's that. There's also people are just ill-informed. People are just busy with their daily lives. They get caught up in the social media frenzy. They're unaware. They're unaware that they're being psychologically manipulated by social media, and they go from the needle face mask, what do they call those things? Emojis in their banners. They go to the Ukraine flag, and now they're going to go to the transgender flag. They don't understand that it's the same game being played over and over again. Even once they say, okay, oh, they were wrong about that. Oh, we now know that they were wrong about face masks. Are we going to learn a lesson? This is a New York Times article. They say, okay, they're wrong about that, but now I'm still believing them on this because they just, I don't know.
It's easier to be sheep.
It's
That's
easier.
Also, that's
and
the other thing.
also, it's easier to claim virtue by being a coward and compliant. I forget who it was. He said, when in history has it ever been a good thing to be a coward and compliant? And I was like, well, pretty much under every dictatorship, that's what the government rewards and that's what the government valorizes.
Yeah.
So people who now say, stay home, don't be selfish, put saran wrap around non-essential items in a pharmacy, but not, it may not make sense, but they're doing their best. The government that literally spent 100 years, or at least in the States, 60 years experimenting on African Americans under the Tuskegee experiments. The same government in Canada that now is apologizing for the residential schools abuse, taking Indigenous children out of their families, putting them in churches where they were getting abused, experimented on. That was then. I'm going to be compliant now because they are saying, good for you. You're a patriotic citizen, and
this time around, a big government is a great thing.
We're doing our best.
In the past, it was bad, but now it's just a wonderful thing for everyone. Yeah,
it's atrocious, and I say it. I have friends that are have woken up. I've met a bunch of people who are part of the resistance. I'm putting all these in quotes because it's like lofty descriptions, and I just know a ton who are like who are buying the propaganda because it's easy to understand. They don't have the time to watch a 3-hour podcast with Joe Rogan. Like the Twitter files is a pretty decent example. People don't know. And they don't even have the time to sit around and watch a 3-hour podcast where it's synthesized and spoon-fed to them in a Joe Rogan podcast, let alone daily live streams with people who are trying to make sense of it. And so what do? Jimmy Dore just had him on recently. He says, look, you can't awaken all the sheep. You just have to gather the lions. And so get 10, 15% of the people and you can affect change.
Completely.
But it's scary to see. It's sad to see. Canada is not a country that I recognize, and nor are the citizens people that I recognize. You're not polite, and you're not a loving, peace-loving, tolerant society when you literally call the cops because you see people who are too close to each other outside. You're not a tolerant society when you're telling people to shut down their businesses, deal with the stress of whatever that causes for the greater good when nobody knows what the hell they're doing. That actually makes you the tyrant.
Yeah, they become intolerant in the name of tolerance.
They stare into the abyss and so long that the abyss ends up staring back and they become the monster that they think they're fighting.
It really makes me think about some of the things that I learned as a kid, given that my parents came from a Jewish heritage. They always taught me that most people will not fight. They will wait for others to fight for them. And it's really why I do what I do. And I think why, people like you are so important, that we do fight and we don't despair and we don't say, well, there are only 10 of us or 10% of us doing it. People do need to be led into the light. And, hopefully you're able to do that.
Well, I do despair from time to time, but more frequently recently than not, because it doesn't seem like there's a bottom to the madness. Like within short order, you have state-funded media, what I consider to be outright grooming of children, like just there for you to see. When a young kid says, I feel uncomfortable with the questions this adult is asking me, and then they keep pushing it like it's cute, that's grooming. When you have the Canadian Army coming out with tweets saying, we're all about inclusivity, Trans Awareness Week, and we're an inclusive, tolerant, thing. And if you don't like it, don't follow us. And it's like,
I remember that tweet. How did a drama student actually tweet that?
I don't know, but I said, you're the same military that fired unvaccinated people for moral, religious, and medical concerns. They're tolerant, and they love the Indigenous, and they love ethnic minorities. Like in Canada, the most undervaxxed demographics were Black Canadians, Indigenous and Latino Canadians. So the military comes out, virtue signals like a bunch of buffoons that we're tolerant and inclusive when we've just imposed vaccine mandates that disparately impacted ethnic minorities, Indigenous Canadians. And it's like, you guys are idiots. Like, you're idiots. But also, what kind of military does this?
It feels like a bunch of 20-year-olds are running the media. That's what it feels like. And by the way, it feels like that in the United States as well.
Well, I mean, it's not much better.
And I have no issue with
States.
20-year-olds, except for they have not lived life and don't have that much experience, let alone to speak on behalf of the military.
But what I love is, like, can you imagine first of all, what Putin is thinking watching this?
Oh my gosh.
Putin is sitting there saying, isn't that rich? Justin Trudeau, who just came in and beat the ever-loving piss out of veterans who were protesting peacefully, is now going to lecture me on acting like an authoritarian dictator? Or President Xi of China is going to say, who the hell are these people to lecture me on human rights violations? Right. But also, like, from a military perspective, I would love to see my enemies sitting there tweeting vapid virtue signaling idiocy. Now, when they have to come out and say, look how good we are, we don't discriminate, it's like, okay, well, the only people who have to talk like that are people who discriminate.
Right.
And lo and behold, you did discriminate with your vaccine mandates. Right. You're tolerant for purported trans in the military. I mean, how many trans individuals are there in the military that this is something that they said, today we have to come out and take a firm stand against this?
No, the enemies are just sitting there and laughing us away.
and expanding and enriching and empowering, and all the while they see what used to be the leaders of the Western world in spiritual, moral, and economic decay. And I'm sitting there, like, I put on a pink shirt today. I've got long hair.
We're matching.
And I'm thinking, like, well, if I were a kid who did this, would I have some adult telling me, Viva, you might actually be a girl, you just don't know it yet? And I was
my gosh.
You idiots who think that you're the most tolerant people because you're promoting these ideas are espousing the most regressive gender stereotypes out there and messing up children's minds. Now it's coming from the Canadian Army, who has no business even chiming in on this.
Unbelievable. Are you seeing that people are able to follow you on Rumble? I know that you moved it was so difficult for you to get your message out, I guess, in Canada, though you're quite big. People do follow you.
Is there any wood here? Now I know I should do it. Touch wood. Poo-poo, I've been very fortunate. Like, my main channel on YouTube, and I'm up to like 3,000 videos, live streams. I've never gotten one strike. I've been good on YouTube, but it's like nonsensical and there's no rhyme or reason to the rules. But like, I've never been controversial for the sake of being controversial, and I've had some demonetization issues. But the exposure was not the issue. It was just YouTube is not a platform that supports free speech, and we know it now. The Twitter files have revealed basically what social media is. They have been co-opted by, it's going to sound Alex Jonesian, they've been co-opted by government and intelligence to control a narrative and to suppress dissenting voices, period. Rumble is the future. It may not always be the future. People are like, well, what happens if Rumble gets bought out by BlackRock? I don't know. It won't. Chris Pavlovsky, the CEO, is a trustworthy, principled person who, if he were in it for the money, would have been out of it a while back. Rumble's amazing. Locals, which they've incorporated, is amazing. There's a difference between social media and media. And people go to Rumble for media. They don't go to Rumble for Facebook, seeing what my friends are posting. And so people are going to Rumble now and treating it like a network, kind of like, say, Fox News, for lack of a better example, but a network where they can hear more independent voices, and not just right-wing ones. In as much, I just still don't think I'm right-wing, but you got Russell Brand, who's, if he's right-wing, then I'm 8 feet tall. Glenn Greenwald, you got Jimmy Dore, you've got independent voices, you got Tulsi Gabbard, and then you've got everybody. You got everybody there. So they're going to Rumble as a network, and it's massively successful. The numbers, not from a monetary perspective, just from a reach perspective, are amazing.
Wow.
And it's working very well. So now I'm exclusive with Rumble in terms of content creation. I start on YouTube and Rumble, and then go to Rumble exclusively, post my stuff later onto YouTube, and personally involved also with Rumble in terms of drafting their community guidelines, terms of service, to ensure their rules will not be applied in a manner to turn Rumble into YouTube.
That part is really fascinating to me. Your background is law, and you come from Canada, where you have the PTSD of censorship at a whole nother level, as we understand now from this interview. So what are you doing with Rumble's terms of service that is different from what YouTube, let's say, would do?
So, and if people may not know, I am Sworn in 2007. I practiced at the biggest law firm in Canada for about 5 years as a student, stagiaire, young lawyer. Left when I had my first daughter and started, I thought I was going to go to study commercial photography, but before I could get rejected from Dawson Commercial Photography, I started getting calls and started my own law firm, solo, built it up. I have 13 years of active practice, IP, copyright, all sorts of stuff, which people might not believe looking at what I look like now. But so when I started getting familiar with Rumble, because I was covering some of their legal issues and I was also on the platform. And at one point it came out, I was like, how do we draft the terms of service so that we preserve free speech? People out there confound free speech with protected speech. And they say, well, I want free speech like Gab. I want to run around saying the N-word and calling, Jews all sorts of slurs. And in a way, in the States, hate speech is still protected speech, even though in Canada, hate speech is outlawed. And so, we drafted the community guidelines terms of service in a way that me and Robert Barnes, who's an American lawyer, so between the two of us, we get the Canadian, the US perspective on how to draft these terms, where if it's unlawful, it will not be the protected speech that you come to the platform for. If you come to the platform and you want to run around shouting the N-word, there's other platforms out there. Like, nobody looks at YouTube and says it's not a free speech platform because it can't post porn there. So there are limitations which are not necessarily entirely exclusively legal, but people say, like, it's not say whatever you want. On the other hand, it's not enact rules that can be weaponized so that when Crowder says the exact same thing the Young Turks say, Crowder gets banned and the Young Turks get a raise. And so that's what we've drafted, which is, if it's illegal in your jurisdiction, it's not protected speech, period. Targeted harassment, which is illegal in different iterations in different jurisdictions, is not going to be permitted. But you're going to have clear rules which are going to be apolitically applied. And so you'll know them. If you want to say certain things, there will be another platform for you. But what people are talking about in free speech is political, uncensored, unadulterated free speech, which is applied apolitically regardless, which is the exact opposite of what we got on Twitter, YouTube, Facebook, and all the other big tech platforms.
The part that is going to become difficult is when places like Canada make it illegal to say certain things. So even if Rumble would want to allow freedom of speech of certain topics, Canada can simply say, well, you're not allowed to speak about the LGBTQ plus XYZ, community.
It's a very real risk, which is part of the reason why, certain lines in the sand for me, where if I can't continue to do what I'm doing, even in my own country, I'm not leaving the country. They're literally kicking me out.
Yeah.
So that's something that is going to be very important to follow. But when the war in Ukraine started and governments across the world said, you got to take RT off your platform, and Rumble and Pavlovsky said, literally, not literally, but F you, metaphorically, electronically. But France said, you got to do it or else. And he says, well, I'm not doing it. So France said, we're blocking Rumble in France. Mm-hmm. Or I don't know if they blocked or they pulled, but Rumble's not available in France because Rumble refused to take RT off the platform. So it's an issue. And I said, the way that they can come after the true free speech platforms, it could be a number of different ways, lawfare, but it could be litigation fare. They were talking about having a disinformation board in the States, make it illegal, and then what do you do? But we'll see. Rumble's fighting. Pavlovsky is a fighter. He's a very concealed fighter. He's a very soft-spoken, docile human being, but a political fighter like I haven't seen in a while. But it's going to be that constant push and pull between the government trying to get more and more and then get you to back off after they've already made 3 feet of gains. And so they'll push 3 feet, back up 2, and then slowly but surely come for everything. So hopefully we can just gather enough lions so that people will start pushing back and making political change. Because I'll say this to cover your tushy and to cover mine as well. The answer will never be violence, despite how much rhetoric there is online of get the ropes and yada, yada. It will not be a violent solution to this, period. Practically speaking, and also I'm not interested in becoming the monster that I'm battling. It has to be grassroots from the bottom up and the top down. At the same time, get people to say this is not cool, to the point where the politicians say, oh, the people don't want this, so I better not want this either. And then it sort of just meets in the middle. But right now, it's there might be something of a tide turning. But if it is, it's turning a little too slowly. So we might have to increase the online mockery, because that I think does go a long way.
Well, I completely agree with you. And one of the things we say around here is education got us into this mess and education will have to get us out. And it really is about public awareness. Everybody says, oh, well, make sure you file a lawsuit. And I say we have to win in the court of public opinion. And as long as the public is brainwashed and unaware, it's going to be very, very difficult to see real change. And we're not about violence. We don't want violence. We want people to actually vote, not vote their rights away, which is what is happening right now. Really appreciate all the work that you're doing. Really appreciate you being here. I'll make a personal commitment to pay more attention to the countries around the United States because I think it really matters. And I hope my audience will follow as well because, the environment in which the United States is living in right now is one that is really scary. And we're going to be directly impacted both by Canada up in the north and everything that is happening in the south. So thanks for coming on. Thanks for educating us. It's great to have you.
Thank you very much for having me.